The Burning Truth, Analyzing Shame and Stigma in Relation to STIs. I'm Sam.
I'm Cody.
I'm Nikki.
According to the CDC, 4 million people are affected with gonorrhea every year. Unfortunately, gonorrhea is only the third most common STI that people are affected with. Millions annually are affected by different kinds of STIs. STIs or STDs, sexually transmitted infections or diseases, are different ways that people have articulated what this is. And it basically is transmitted through sexual contact from person to person. Because of this prevalence of millions of Americans being affected by STIs, our group thought it was important to understand what the attitudes are toward STIs. For our study, we looked at different variables relating to STI-related shame and STI-related stigma. We looked at individual variables such as extraversion, masculinity, and sexual health education.
The first independent measure that we decided to use was extraversion. Previous research focused mostly on studies of risky behavior and also things like neuroticism and psychoticism. So the purpose of this study was to examine if higher rates of extraversion would be predicting possibly higher STI-related shame and stigma. The hypothesis for extraversion was there will be a negative correlation between extraversion and STI-related shame and STI-related stigma. Our second independent measure was masculinity. Previous research focused mostly on how higher masculinity may result in things like more risky sexual behavior, more independence, and trying to follow the society standards for masculinity. So the purpose of this study was to find if there was a correlation between masculinity levels and attitudes towards STIs. The hypothesis for masculinity is that there will be a positive correlation between rates of masculinity and negative attitudes toward STIs. And finally, our third measure was sexual education. Previous research was focusing on if sexual education was linked to positive or negative attitudes towards STIs. So that is what I wanted to do here with this study. The hypothesis is there will be a negative correlation between sexual health education and attitudes towards STIs. For our methods, we had about 30 participants from Reddit. That is the site that we used. And we only recorded 28. Of the 28, we had 8 men and 20 female. Our mean age was 23.35 and our standard deviation was 7.37. We also asked questions such as abstinence or comprehensive, whether these programs were used in grade school for sexual health education. 10 said abstinence only and 18 said comprehensive. We also asked if participants had ever been tested for STIs, not if they tested positive or negative, but if they've ever been tested. And 13 said yes, and 14 said no. And then the procedure that we used is we composed a survey on Qualtrics to gather our data.
For all of our studies, we all looked at the shame and stigma scale, which is a 5-point Likert scale. Individually, I used the masculine behavior scale from Snell. And out of the 4 subscales, the primary ones that I was looking at were the restrictive emotionality subscale and the exaggerated self-reliance and control subscale. Sam looked at the Eysenck's personality questionnaire, and Nikki looked at the sexual health education necessity scale, or the Shen scale. I found that there was a positive correlation between shame, stigma, and the restrictive emotionality subscale. And I also found that there was a positive correlation between exaggerated self-reliance and control and shame, but there was a negative correlation between stigma and the exaggerated self-reliance and control subscale. My hypothesis was those who score higher on the masculine behavior scale will show more shame and stigma towards STIs. I found that this was moderately supported. I found the relationships that I thought I would, but many of my results were insignificant. Some exploratory analyses that I ran a sex difference exploratory analyses, and I found that men scored higher than women on the exaggerated self-reliance and control subscale, but I found this relationship to be insignificant. And I also found that men scored higher than women on the restrictive emotionality subscale. I did find that this was significant, however. I also looked at age differences. I looked at the relationship between emerging adults, which are people from the age of 18 to 25, and adults who are anybody above the age of 25. And I found that emerging adults scored lower on the restrictive emotionality subscale. This relationship was insignificant. And I also found that they scored lower than adults on the exaggerated self-reliance control subscale, which was also found to be insignificant. For my study, I only used 2 of the 4 subscales, a part of the masculine behavior scale. So there could have been relationships that I missed because I did not look at all 4 subscales. In the future, I would have used a larger sample size, and I would have used all 4 subscales.
For extroversion, there was not a significant correlation, meaning that my hypothesis was then incorrect. I thought it was going to be a negative correlation, but it ended up being not significant, but leaning more toward a positive correlation. Aside from the correlation analyses, I also did an independent t-test and an ANOVA test, both indicating that there was no statistically significant difference between the relationship with them. Although there wasn't anything statistically significant, that doesn't mean that there wasn't anything that was not noteworthy to find. So I found that on average, females reported higher levels of extroversion, males reported higher levels of STI-related shame, and likewise, males also reported higher levels of STI-related stigma. Although it's possible that extroversion, shame, and stigma have no significant relationship, it is possible that there is. The only really way to know that is to keep doing more testing with larger sample sizes and more diverse sample sizes with better demographic questions.
Results for sexual education. So I did find a strong correlation between the sexual health education necessity scale and stigma that was significant. And then I also found that the sexual health education necessity scale correlated with shame was also strongly correlated. However, it was not significant. So there was a strong positive correlation between sexual health education and shame and stigma. However, the only one that was significant was stigma. So those who are sexually educated are more likely to possess stigmas and have shame, which was actually not the hypothesis that I originally had. I believe there was going to be a negative correlation. However, it looks as though sexual health education programs could possibly be promoting or harboring shame and stigma. So that is something that I believe future researchers should look into when discussing STD and STI attitudes.
Our sample size was very small. Again, we only had 28 people, and of those 8 people, of those 28 people, 8 were men and 20 were women. 28 people is not a large enough sample size to generalize our findings to society. And it was very lopsided. So those 20 women outweigh the 8 men heavily. And also in our demographic section of our survey, we did not ask about race. So it's possible that we could have missed correlations that could have had to deal with that.